The night a little girl chose me instead of a doctor was the night everything I believed about control started to crack. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and exhaustion, the kind that clings to your skin after too many hours under fluorescent lights, and I was halfway down the corridor checking my watch when I felt it. That shift in the air, subtle but sharp, like something fragile about to break, and then I heard small footsteps, uneven, rushing, and before anyone else reacted, she was already there, standing right in front of me, clutching a worn pink backpack with both hands like it was the only thing. Holding her together, her eyes wide, glassy, too old for her face. And she didn't look at the nurses or the security guard or the front desk. She looked at me, straight into me, like she had already decided, like she had already chosen. "My stepdad found us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it cut through everything. Through the distant beeping monitors and the low hum of machines and the quiet conversations that suddenly stopped. And for a second no one moved. Not the nurse behind the counter, not the orderly pushing a cart, not even the guard by the elevator, because something about the way she said it didn't sound like panic. It sounded like certainty, like a countdown had already started. I crouched down slowly, careful not to startle her, my suit jacket tightening across my shoulders as I lowered myself to her level. "Where is your mom?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, controlled, the way I always do. But she shook her head, gripping that backpack tighter. She said to run if he came. And that was enough. I didn't ask another question. I didn't need more context. I didn't need a full story. I stood up and turned slightly, just enough for the men behind me to understand without words. "Lock this floor down," I said quietly. And within seconds the rhythm of the hospital changed. Security radios crackled, doors clicked shut. Movement shifted from casual to deliberate, and I could feel eyes on me now, confused, wary, calculating, but none of that mattered, because when I looked back down, she hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, just stood there like she had finally reached the one place she thought might hold. "What's your name?" I asked, softer this time, and she hesitated like names were something you had to be careful with. "Lily," she said, and I nodded once. "Okay. Lily, you stay right here with me." She didn't argue, didn't ask why. She just stepped a little closer, her small hand brushing the sleeve of my jacket like she needed to confirm I was real. And that's when the elevator doors opened at the far end of the hall, a stretcher rolling out fast, nurses moving around it, voices overlapping, controlled but urgent. And I saw her before Lily did, pale under the overhead lights, an oxygen mask in place, her hair damp against her temples, and Lily's fingers tightened around my sleeve. "That's my mom," she whispered, and something in my chest shifted in a way I didn't like, something unfamiliar, inconvenient. I straightened, my gaze moving from the woman on the stretcher to the hallway beyond, calculating distance, timing, risk, because if the man Lily was talking about was coming, he wouldn't wait. And this place, for all its rules and protocols and polite smiles, wasn't built to keep someone like that out. But I was. I stepped slightly in front of Lily without thinking, not blocking her view, just enough to create space, a barrier that didn't exist a minute ago. And when the stretcher disappeared through the double doors, she didn't follow. She stayed beside me, like that decision had already been made too. "He always says no one will stop him," she murmured, more to herself than to me, and I glanced down at her, at the way she held her breath like she was waiting for something inevitable, and I felt that crack again, deeper this time, spreading through the part of me that never hesitated, never second-guessed. "He hasn't met me," I said, not loud, not dramatic, just a fact placed gently into the space between us. And for the first time since she ran up to me, Lily looked up with something different in her eyes. Not fear, not yet trust, but something close enough to make a promise. Feel dangerous. And I realized then, standing in that sterile hallway with a child who had chosen me for reasons she couldn't explain, that whatever walked through those doors next wasn't just going to find a hospital waiting for him. It was going to find me. The doors to the intensive care unit closed with a soft hiss, sealing Claire Bennett behind glass and protocol. And Lily did not take her eyes off that spot like if she blinked her mother might disappear again. So I stayed exactly where I was, one step ahead of her, one step between her and everything else, while the hallway shifted around us, nurses whispering, security moving with more intention now, radios murmuring in low static bursts that most people would not notice, but I did. because tension has a sound if you know how to listen, and right now it was building. Is she going to be okay? Lily asked without looking at me, her voice thinner now that the first wave of urgency had passed, and I did not give her false comfort. I never do. She is in the right place, I said, and she nodded like that was enough, like she understood that answers sometimes come in pieces, not promises. A nurse approached us carefully, her badge reading Melissa, her eyes flicking between me and the men positioned discreetly at both ends of the corridor. Sir, only family is allowed past this point, she said, professional but uncertain, and I met her gaze without raising my voice. She is family, I replied, placing a hand lightly on Lily's shoulder, not controlling, just anchoring, and something in my tone made her hesitate, then nod, stepping back without another word. Systems are only as strong as the people enforcing them. And tonight they were already bending. Lily shifted closer, her small fingers curling into the fabric of my sleeve again, not asking permission, just taking what she needed. He always comes when it is quiet, she whispered, and I followed her line of sight down the hall toward the elevators, calculating again, timing, entry points, blind spots, because men like the one she described do not announce themselves. They slip in. They rely on hesitation, on confusion, on the assumption that no one will challenge them. But I had already removed that assumption from the equation. My phone vibrated once in my pocket. A single message, confirmation that every entrance on this floor was now monitored, every exit accounted for. Not a lockdown that would alarm the public, just enough control to tilt the outcome. I glanced down at Lily. When he gets here, you stay behind me, I said, simple, direct, and she nodded immediately. No argument, no fear in the gesture, just trust forming in real time, fragile but undeniable, the kind that does not come from words but from presence. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor then, heavier, faster, not rushed in panic but driven, purposeful, and the air shifted again, sharper this time. A man in his late 30s came into view, jacket half buttoned, expression tight with something that tried to look like concern but did not quite reach his eyes. Travis Cole. I knew the name before anyone said it. Because men like him leave patterns, and patterns leave traces. He scanned the hallway, dismissing the staff, the guards, until his gaze landed on Lily, and something in his posture changed, a claim, an expectation. Lily, he called out, his voice carrying just enough authority to suggest ownership, and I felt her hand tighten against my sleeve. But she did not move toward him, not even a step. I took one forward. Instead, closing the distance by exactly 3 feet, enough to shift the dynamic, enough to make him adjust without realizing why. You are not allowed past this point, I said, calm, measured, and he stopped, not because of the rule, but because of the tone. People always recognize when they are no longer the one in control. That is my wife in there and my daughter standing behind you, he replied, irritation threading through his words, and I tilted my head slightly, studying him the way I study everything that might become a problem. Your wife is receiving care, and the child has chosen where she stands, I said, not raising my voice, not escalating, just stating reality as it existed now. And for a moment the hallway held its breath, staff pretending to work, security pretending not to watch, Lily completely still behind me, and Travis exhaled slowly, recalibrating, trying a different approach, softer this time. Sweetheart, come here, you are safe, he said, extending a hand. That did not quite hide the tension in his fingers, and I did not move. I did not need to, because Lily did not respond, not a step, not a word, just silence that spoke louder than anything else in the room. And that was the moment the balance shifted completely, not because of me, not because of him, but because a child decided she was not going back. And I felt that same crack in my chest widen into something irreversible as I looked at him and realized this was no longer just about control. This was about a line that had already been crossed, and I do not let lines like that stay broken. Travis did not lower his hand right away, but the hesitation was there now, subtle, almost invisible to anyone who did not know how to read it, and I did, because hesitation is the first sign that control is slipping. You are scaring her, he said finally, shifting his tone again, softer, almost reasonable, as if the entire situation could be reframed with the right words. and I let a brief silence settle between us before answering. She made her choice before I said a word. I replied, and behind me, I felt Lily move just half an inch closer, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to register the decision repeating itself, reinforcing, and that mattered more than anything Travis could say. A doctor stepped out from behind the glass doors then, mask lowered, expression composed but alert. "We are stabilizing her condition," he said, addressing no one in particular. But his eyes flicked toward me, then to Travis, then back again, measuring the tension he had walked into. "She is asking for her daughter." Lily's grip tightened instantly, her breath catching, and I glanced down at her. "You can see her," I said quietly. "But you stay with me." She nodded without hesitation, and when the nurse opened the door, I walked with her, not behind, not leading, just beside, a steady presence that did not demand attention but held it anyway. The room inside was quieter, machines humming in low rhythm, Claire Bennett lying still against the white sheets, her face pale, but conscious now, her eyes searching until they found Lily, and everything in her expression broke open at once. Relief, fear, disbelief, all tangled together. "Lily," she whispered, her voice thin but urgent, and Lily moved forward this time, crossing the distance in 3 quick steps, stopping just short of the bed like she had been taught to be careful in places like this. "I am here," she said, her voice small but steady, and Claire reached for her, fingers trembling slightly, not weak, just overwhelmed, and then her gaze shifted, landing on me standing just inside the doorway, and I saw it immediately, the calculation, the fear, the instinct to protect, even like this, even now. She pulled Lily slightly closer, not away from me exactly, but closer to herself. "Who is he?" she asked, not loudly, but with enough edge to make the question clear, and Lily looked back at me as if waiting for permission to answer. And that alone told me everything I needed to know about how fast trust can form when it is needed. "He is helping us," Lily said before I could respond. Simple, direct, and Claire's eyes narrowed just slightly, not rejecting the idea, but not accepting it either, caught between gratitude and instinct. I stepped forward just enough to be seen clearly, not invading her space, just making sure there were no shadows. "You can focus on getting better," I said, my voice even, controlled. "No one will come near you without going through me first." And she held my gaze for a second longer than most people would, searching for something, a crack, a lie, anything that would tell her I was not what I claimed to be in that moment. But I did not look away, I never do. And something in her expression shifted, not trust, not yet, but recognition, maybe, of certainty. Behind us the door opened again, a nurse stepping in, followed by a hospital administrator who looked like he had just been pulled into a situation he did not understand. "Sir, we need to discuss access." "Permissions," the administrator began, his voice polite but strained, and I did not turn fully, just enough to acknowledge him. "You already have your answer," I said, and he paused, clearly weighing policy against presence, against the way the room felt now. And before he could push further, Travis's voice carried from the hallway, louder this time, sharper, pressing against the boundaries that had been set. "I have every legal right to be in that room," he called out, and Claire flinched, just slightly, but I saw it, and so did Lily, whose small hand tightened around her mother's. And that was enough. I stepped back toward the door, placing myself between the room and the hallway again, the line redrawn, clearer now, stronger, and as I reached for the handle, I glanced once more at Claire, at the way she held her daughter like she was trying to rebuild something that had been broken for a long time. "Rest," I said quietly. "I will handle this." And for the first time since I had met her, she did not question it. She did not argue. She just nodded once, a small movement, but heavy with everything she had not said. And when I stepped back into the corridor, closing the door behind me, I did not see Travis as a problem anymore. I saw him as something already decided. And that changed everything. I closed the distance between us slowly, not rushing, not forcing, because men like Travis Cole expect confrontation to look loud and obvious. And when it does not, when it comes quiet and controlled, it unsettles them in ways they cannot immediately understand. "You need to leave," I said, my voice even, carrying just enough weight to reach him without rising. And he let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Except there was no humor in it. You think you can just step in here and decide that? He asked, his eyes flicking briefly to the men positioned along the corridor, then back to me, calculating, trying to map out where his leverage still existed, and I took one step closer, closing the gap just enough that he had to tilt his head slightly to maintain eye contact. A small shift, but deliberate. I do not think, I replied. I decide. And the silence that followed stretched just long enough for the meaning to settle, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a statement of how the next few minutes were going to unfold. Behind me, I could feel the door to Claire's room, the quiet presence of Lily on the other side of it, and that anchored everything. This was not about territory or reputation, not tonight. This was about a boundary that had already been crossed too many times, and I was not interested in letting it happen again. Travis exhaled slowly, adjusting his jacket like he was trying to regain composure. That is my family, he said, more firmly. Now, leaning into the word like it still carried authority, and I let my gaze hold his for a second longer before answering. Family is not a word you get to use just because you say it, I said, and something in his expression tightened. Not anger exactly, something sharper, something closer to being exposed. A nurse passed by quickly, avoiding eye contact, the administrator from earlier hovering near the nurse's station, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. And that hesitation worked in my favor. It always does. Systems hesitate. I do not. Travis shifted his stance, trying to angle past me, not aggressively, just enough to test whether I would move, and I did not. Not even half an inch. Step aside, he said, quieter now, controlled. The way people speak when they believe lowering their voice gives them more power, and I shook my head once, almost imperceptibly. You are done here, I said, and for the first time since he arrived, the mask slipped, just slightly, just enough for me to see what was underneath, not concern, not fear for Claire, but frustration at losing access, at losing control over something he had assumed was his to manage. And that confirmed everything. My phone vibrated again in my pocket. Another update. Background information already compiling. Patterns connecting faster than most people would believe possible. And I did not need to read it to know what it would say. I had seen enough already. You should take the exit to your left, I added, nodding slightly down the corridor, giving him a path that preserved whatever dignity he still thought he had. Because forcing a man like him rarely ends cleanly, but giving him a choice, even a controlled one, often does. He glanced in that direction, then back at me, weighing it, measuring risk against pride. And for a moment I thought he might push further, might test the line one more time. But then his gaze flicked past me toward the closed door, toward the reality he could no longer reach, and something in him recalibrated. This is not over, he said finally, not loud, not dramatic, just a statement meant to linger, and I held his gaze. Without reacting, because men like him rely on reactions, on escalation, on emotional openings they can exploit, and I do not give those away. It is for tonight, I replied, and that was enough. He stood there for one more second, just long enough to make it look like the decision was still his, then turned and walked down the corridor, his footsteps echoing until the elevator doors opened and closed with a soft chime, and the tension that had been stretched across the floor began to release, not all at once, but in small, controlled increments, like a room remembering how to breathe again. I remained where I was for a moment longer, listening, confirming, making sure the line held even after he was gone. Then I turned back toward the door and pushed it open, stepping inside to find Lily exactly where I had left her, sitting close to her mother's bed, her small hand wrapped around Claire's fingers, and Claire looked up at me as I entered, searching my face for an answer I had not yet given. He is gone, I said simply, and the relief that crossed her expression was quiet but undeniable, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just the absence of something that had been pressing down on her for too long. And Lily let out a breath she had been holding, leaning slightly into her mother without even realizing it, and I stood there for a second, watching them, the way they fit together in that moment, fragile but intact, and I understood something then that I had not planned on understanding tonight, that protecting them was not going to end with one decision in a hallway. It was going to require something more permanent, something that extended beyond these walls, beyond this moment. And I do not walk into things halfway, not ever. The room settled into a quieter rhythm after that. The kind of stillness that only comes when something loud has just passed, and no one is quite ready to trust the silence yet. And I remained by the door for a moment longer than necessary, not because I needed to, but because leaving too soon would have broken the fragile sense of control that had just been rebuilt. Claire adjusted slightly against the pillows, her eyes never fully leaving me even as she smoothed Lily's hair with careful fingers, a motion so instinctive it did not need thought. And I could see the questions forming behind her gaze, not just about who I was, but about what came next, because moments like this do not end cleanly. They extend, they follow you home. You should not have done that, she said finally, her voice steadier now, but edged with something that was not quite disapproval, more like caution shaped by experience. And I stepped further into the room, letting the door close softly behind me. He should not have come here, I replied, and she exhaled slowly, like she had expected that answer and was not sure whether to argue with it or accept it. Lily shifted slightly, resting her head against her mother's arm, her eyes watching me with a quiet intensity that children only have when they are trying to understand something bigger than themselves. Is he coming back? She asked, and I shook my head once, not dismissive, just certain. Not tonight, I said, and she nodded like that was enough for now. Like safety could be measured in hours if not in guarantees. Claire's gaze sharpened at that, catching the part one did not say, and I saw her mind move ahead of the conversation, connecting possibilities, consequences, risk. And tomorrow, she asked, and I did not answer immediately, not because I did not know, but because answers like that change things. They shift people from surviving to deciding, and that matters. Tomorrow is different, I said, choosing the truth in a way she could hear. And she studied me for a long second, weighing that, measuring whether I was someone she could trust with decisions that extended beyond this room, beyond this night. And I did not rush her. Trust is not something you take. It is something that forms when there is no other option left. The monitor beside her bed let out a steady, even tone, grounding the moment in something real, something measurable, and I reached into my jacket slowly, pulling out my phone, not to check messages, but to make a call. Prepare a temporary residence, I said quietly once the line connected, stepping just far enough away to give them space without leaving the room entirely. Close, secure, no prior records attached. I paused, listening, then added, and have legal documentation ready by morning. When I ended the call, Claire was watching me again, more intently now, the caution still there, but something else layered beneath it, something closer to reluctant understanding. You are planning something, she said, not accusing, just stating what she had already realized, and I slipped the phone back into my pocket, meeting her gaze directly. I am preventing this from happening. Again, I answered, and Lily looked between us, her small brow furrowing slightly. Does that mean we are leaving? She asked, and Claire's hand tightened gently around hers, instinctively protective, even as uncertainty flickered across her face, and I stepped closer again, stopping at the edge of the bed, not crossing into their space, just close enough that my words would not need to travel far. It means you will be somewhere he cannot reach, I said, and the room went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence, not fragile, not uncertain, but heavy with decision. Claire's gaze dropped briefly to Lily, then returned to me, and I could see the conflict there, the part of her that did not want to rely on anyone, that had learned the cost of trusting the wrong person, and the part of her that understood that doing nothing was no longer an option. You do not even know us, she said softly, and I held her gaze without hesitation. I know enough, I replied, and for a second longer she searched my face, looking for something to push against, something to refuse, but there was nothing there except certainty, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders eased just a fraction, not surrender, not acceptance, but the beginning of something that could become both. Lily shifted closer to her, then looked back at me, her voice quieter now, but steady. Are you staying? She asked, and I did not look away, not from her, not from Claire. Yes, I said, and it was the simplest answer I had given all night, and the most final. The word yes did not echo in the room, but it settled into everything, into the quiet hum of the machines, into the way Lily's shoulders finally lowered just a fraction, into the way Claire's fingers loosened slightly around her daughter's hand, not because the danger had disappeared, but because for the first time it felt contained, and I remained where I was for a moment, letting that shift take hold before anything else moved forward. Because rushing after a moment like that breaks it. And I do not break things that are working. You do not have to do this, Claire said after a while, her voice softer now, less defensive, but still holding on to something that sounded like independence, like she needed to remind herself of it even as the situation pulled her in another direction. And I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the truth in her words without agreeing to the implication. You are right, I said. I do not have to. And she watched me closely, waiting for the rest, for the reason, for the condition that usually follows a statement like that. But I did not add one, not immediately. Because sometimes silence forces people to confront what they already know, and after a second, her gaze shifted slightly, like she understood that the answer was not about obligation, it was about choice. Lily adjusted her position on the bed, curling closer to her mother, her small voice cutting gently through the quiet. Then why are you? She asked, and I looked at her, really looked this time, at the way she held herself, alert even in stillness, the way her eyes tracked everything in the room without appearing to. And I answered her the only way that made sense. Because you asked me to help, I said, and she accepted that without hesitation, like children often do when the answer is simple and honest. But Claire did not. Her gaze sharpened again, searching for what I was not saying. People do not just do things like this for no reason, she said. And there it was, the part of her that had learned that nothing comes without a cost, that help is rarely given without expectation. And I met her eyes evenly, not challenging, not defensive, just steady. You are right. Again, I said, most people do not. And I let that sit there, not denying it, not dressing it up, just placing it where it belonged. And the room held that truth for a moment, not comfortable, but real. A nurse stepped in briefly to check the monitor, adjusting a setting, offering a quiet reassurance that Claire's vitals were stable, then stepped back out, leaving us in that suspended space again. And I moved closer to the window, glancing out at the dark glass reflecting the corridor lights. Rain tracing thin lines down the surface, the city beyond blurred into something distant and unreachable. There was a time, I said finally, my voice lower now, not for effect, but because the memory did not belong in the same tone as everything else, when I chose not to get involved. I did not turn back to them yet, not because I could not, but because some things are easier to say without watching the reaction form in real time. It seemed cleaner that way, simpler, I continued. But it did not stay simple. I paused, letting the weight of that settle without explaining every detail, because I did not need to, not for them to understand what mattered. Behind me I could feel Claire's attention shift, not just listening now, but reassessing, recalibrating. The way she saw me, and Lily remained quiet, her presence steady, absorbing more than most people would expect. So now, I added, turning slightly back toward them. When I see something that should not happen, I do not wait for someone else to fix it. And that was as close to an explanation as I was going to give, not a confession, not a justification, just a line drawn between who I had been and what I was choosing now. Claire held my gaze for a long second, and something in her expression softened, not completely, not all at once, but enough to make room for something new, something that was not there before. And what happens when this does not stay simple either? She asked quietly, and I stepped back from the window, returning to where I had been before, the same distance, the same position, controlled, deliberate. Then I handle that too, I said, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just the same certainty that had carried through everything else tonight. Lily shifted again, her eyes growing heavier now, the exhaustion finally catching up with her, and she leaned more fully into Claire, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I believe you, she murmured, not as a statement meant to be heard, but one that carried anyway. And Claire's hand moved gently through her hair, her gaze still on me, weighing, considering, and then slowly, almost reluctantly, she nodded once, a small movement, but one that changed the room again, because this time it was not just relief settling in, it was trust beginning to take shape, fragile, incomplete, but real enough to matter. And I understood then that whatever came next was no longer just something I was managing. It was something I was responsible for, and that distinction changes everything. The room grew quieter. As Lily's breathing slowed, the steady rhythm of sleep replacing the tension she had been holding on to for too long, and Claire adjusted the blanket gently over her, careful not to wake her, her movements soft but deliberate, like someone who had learned to protect even in the smallest ways, and I remained where I was, watching without intruding, because moments like this are not meant to be interrupted, they are meant to be understood. And when Claire finally looked up at me again, there was something different in her expression now, not just caution, not just gratitude, but a kind of quiet resolve that had not been there before. "She trusts you," she said, her voice low so it would not disturb Lily, and I nodded once, acknowledging the truth without claiming it. "She made a decision," I replied, and Claire's lips pressed together slightly, like she was weighing that against everything she had experienced, everything she had learned about trusting the wrong people. "Children should not have to make decisions like that," she said, and there was no anger in it, just a tired honesty that carried more weight than anything louder could have. I took a step closer to the foot of the bed, keeping my distance but making my presence clear. "They should not." I agreed, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence between us no longer tense, but not entirely comfortable either, because comfort takes time, and time is something we did not fully have yet. Claire shifted slightly, wincing just enough to reveal that the pain she was holding back had not disappeared, just been set aside, and I noticed the way she tried to hide it, not wanting to appear weak, not wanting to give anyone a reason to take control away from her again. "You should rest," I said, and she let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, except there was no humor in it. "Resting has not exactly been an option lately," she replied, and I studied her for a second, not just her words, but the way she carried them, the way exhaustion had settled into her posture without breaking her completely, and that told me more than anything else she could have said. "It is now," I answered, and she looked at me like she wanted to challenge that, like she had spent too long relying only on herself to accept something that easily. But then her gaze flicked to Lily, to the way her daughter was finally asleep without tension in her small frame, and something in her expression softened again, just slightly. "You make it sound simple," she said, and I shook my head once. "It is not simple," I replied, "but it is handled," and that distinction mattered, because simplicity is an illusion, but control is not, and Claire seemed to understand that, even if she was not ready to fully accept it yet. The monitor beside her let out a steady tone again, grounding us in the present, in something measurable and real, and I reached for my phone once more, not to check anything this time, but to confirm what was already in motion. "The car will be here in 30 minutes, I said, and her eyes narrowed slightly, processing that. "You are moving us tonight," she said, not a question, just recognition, and I nodded. "Yes," I replied, and she looked down at Lily again, her hand brushing lightly through her daughter's hair, a protective gesture that did not need explanation. "She is tired," Claire said quietly, and I stepped a little closer, lowering my voice to match the calm in the room. "Then we move carefully," I said. "Nothing rushed, nothing loud." And she held my gaze for a moment longer, searching for any sign that this plan would take control away from her, that it would put her in another situation where she had no say, and I did not look away, because this time the control was different. This time it was about protection, not possession, and slowly, she nodded again, a little more certain than before, a little less reluctant. "Okay," she said, and that single word carried more weight than anything else she had given me so far, because it was not forced, it was chosen, and Lily shifted slightly in her sleep, her small hand still wrapped around Claire's, like she was holding on to something she was not ready to let go of, and I understood that too, because letting go is not something you do all at once. It happens in pieces, in moments like this, where safety begins to feel possible again. And as I stood there, watching the two of them, I realized that tonight was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something that would require more than presence, more than control. It would require consistency, and that is something I do not offer lightly, but when I do not take it back. The next 30 minutes moved with a kind of quiet precision that most people would not notice, but I did, because every second mattered when you were transitioning from temporary safety to something more controlled, and I stayed near the door, while Claire gathered what little she had with her, not rushing her, not interrupting, just watching the way she moved, careful with every motion, aware of every sound, like someone who had learned that even small noises could draw the wrong kind of attention, and that told me more than any explanation ever could. Lily stirred once as Claire adjusted her eyes opening halfway, unfocused at first until they found me. And even in that half-awake state, she did not look confused. She just looked reassured, like she remembered exactly where she was and why. "Are we going?" she whispered, her voice thick with sleep, and Claire brushed her hair back gently. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, soft but steady, and Lily nodded against her, already trusting the movement before it even happened, and I stepped forward then, closing the distance just enough to make the next part easier. "I will carry her," I said, not asking, just offering, and Claire hesitated for half a second, not out of distrust, but out of instinct, the kind that makes a parent hold on a little tighter before letting go, and I did not move closer until she gave the smallest nod. Permission granted in a way that did not need words, and when I reached down, lifting Lily carefully, she did not resist, she simply settled against me, her head resting against my shoulder like it was the most natural place in the world, and that trust, given so easily, felt heavier than anything else I had carried tonight. Claire watched us for a moment, something unreadable passing through her expression before she turned to grab her bag, and I adjusted my hold slightly, making sure Lily was comfortable, secure, before stepping toward the door, the hallway outside quieter now, the late hour thinning out the noise, but my men were still positioned exactly where they needed to be, subtle but present, and as we moved, the hospital seemed to part around us without anyone quite realizing why. Doors opening at the right moment, staff stepping aside without being asked, not out of fear, but out of recognition that something about this situation did not follow the usual rules, and I kept my pace steady, not fast, not slow, just controlled, because speed draws attention and hesitation creates openings, and I allow neither. The elevator door slid open before we even reached them, timing precise, and I stepped inside first, Claire following close behind, her eyes scanning the space automatically, still alert even now. And when the doors closed, sealing us into that small, contained box, the outside world seemed to fall away for a moment, leaving only the soft hum of the elevator and the quiet weight of Lily resting against me. "Where are you taking us?" Claire asked, her voice low but clear, and I met her gaze without hesitation. "Somewhere safe," I said, and she held that answer for a second, not fully satisfied, but not rejecting it either, because at this point safety mattered more than details. The elevator slowed, then stopped, the doors opening to the underground level where the air felt cooler, quieter, more controlled, and the car was already waiting, exactly where it should be, engine running, door open, everything prepared without needing to be checked twice. I stepped out first, adjusting my hold on Lily as we crossed the short distance, and she shifted slightly, her hand curling lightly against my jacket like she was anchoring herself even in sleep, and Claire followed closely, her movements still cautious but less tense than before, because movement itself had become part of the plan now, not something she had to fight against. I guided them into the back seat, making sure Lily was settled comfortably before stepping back, giving Claire the space to sit beside her. And for a moment we were all still again, the kind of pause that happens right before something changes, and Claire looked at me, really looked this time, not just assessing, not just questioning, but seeing, trying to understand the person who had stepped into her life without warning and shifted everything in a matter of hours. "This does not feel real," she said quietly, and I gave a slight nod, because I understood that feeling. The moment when everything changes so quickly it feels disconnected from reality. "It is real," I replied, "and it is not temporary." And that was the difference, not just a promise for tonight, but something that extended beyond it. And she held my gaze for a second longer, then looked down at Lily, her expression softening in a way that did not need to be explained, because for her, reality was not about understanding me. It was about her daughter being safe, and that was something I could provide without explanation. I closed the door gently, stepping back as the car began to move, watching it disappear into the night. And for the first time since Lily had walked up to me in that hallway, I allowed myself to exhale, not because the situation was over, but because it had shifted into something I could control completely. And as I turned back toward the entrance, the rain still falling in thin, steady lines. I knew that what came next would not be decided by chance or fear. It would be decided by me. The rain had not stopped by the time I stepped back outside. It never does in this city when something important is shifting beneath the surface. And I stood there for a moment watching the streetlights reflect off the wet pavement, the sound of tires moving through water low and steady, grounding everything that had just happened into something real, something final. Because moments like that hallway, that room, they feel suspended, like they exist outside of time, but they do not, they lead somewhere. And I was already there. My phone vibrated once, and I answered without looking at the screen. They are secured. The voice on the other end said, calm, efficient, exactly what I expected. No disruptions, no tracking, everything clean. I nodded slightly even though they could not see me. Good, I replied, and ended the call without another word, because details like that do not need discussion, they need execution. And that part was already in motion. I turned back toward the entrance briefly, the hospital doors sliding open and closed as people moved in and out, unaware of what had just been redirected within those walls, unaware that a decision made by a little girl had changed the trajectory of more than just one night. And I understood that now in a way I had not when she first spoke to me. Because it had not been about me choosing to get involved. It had been about her choosing who she trusted when everything else had already failed her. And that kind of choice carries weight, the kind you do not ignore. I stepped into the waiting car that had remained for me, the interior quiet, controlled, insulated from the noise outside, and as we pulled away, I let my gaze rest on the road ahead, not because I needed to see it, but because forward was the only direction that mattered now. Background is coming in, the driver said after a moment, handing me a tablet without turning around, and I took it, scanning the information quickly. Claire Bennett, 27, part-time work, no stable support system, records that told a story without needing to be explained, and Travis Cole, a name that appeared in places it should not, patterns that aligned with things I had already seen before, nothing unexpected, but enough to confirm that this was not something that would resolve itself quietly, and that was fine. I do not rely on quiet resolutions. I rely on control. I set the tablet aside, my attention shifting from information to intention, because knowing is only useful if you act on it. And I already knew what needed to happen next, not in detail, not in steps, but in outcome. They would not go back to what they had come from. That part was already decided. The car slowed as we approached a turn, the city stretching out ahead in blurred lights and shadow, and I leaned back slightly, letting the movement settle into something steady, something predictable, because everything else about tonight had not been, and that contrast mattered. It created space to think clearly, to decide without pressure, and I do not make decisions like this lightly, not because I hesitate, but because once I decide, I do not reverse it. My phone vibrated again. A new message this time, confirmation that legal documentation was already being prepared. Temporary residence secured under a name that did not connect back to anything traceable. Everything aligning the way it should when the right resources are applied correctly, and I allowed myself a brief moment of stillness, not relief, not satisfaction, just recognition that the structure was in place, that what had started as a single moment in a hospital corridor had already become something far more permanent. And I thought of Lily then, the way she had looked at me without hesitation, without calculation, just certainty, and that stayed with me in a way I had not expected, because trust given that freely is not something you dismiss. It is something you either honor or break. And I do not break things that are placed in my hands like that. The car came to a smooth stop at a light, red, reflecting across the windshield, and I glanced at it briefly before looking ahead again, because waiting is part of control too, knowing when to move and when to hold. And when the light changed, we moved forward without pause, seamless, uninterrupted, and I knew that somewhere ahead, Claire would be watching the road in silence, still unsure, still adjusting, and Lily would be asleep beside her, trusting that the direction they were going would not lead them back to where they had been. And, for the first time in a long time, that trust was not misplaced, because this time, they were not just leaving something behind, they were stepping into something that had already been decided, something that would not bend, would not hesitate, and would not allow anyone to reach them again. And as the city opened up in front of us, I made the final decision without needing to say it out loud. not to anyone else, not even to myself. Because it was already understood, they were not just under my protection for tonight. They were mine to protect from this moment forward. And that was not a promise, it was a fact.